Hey, what's up? Good day everyone, this is James Ryan B. Baring of BS Chem 2H1. Welcome to this virtual lecture of Rizal's life and work. In the previous lessons, it was discussed that in the 19th century, it is commonly depicted as the birth of modern life as well as the birth of many nations around the globe. The century was also a period of massive changes, not just in Europe, not just in Spain, but also here in the Philippines. Last week, we also discussed the importance of studying Rizal's life and as well as the RA 1425 or the Rizal Law. In this lecture, we are going to be dealing with the political landscape in the 19th century. The so-called political influences in the 19th century has largely impacted the locals in our country, particularly Jose Rizal. So, let us tackle about these political influences. So, what is this Bourbon Reform? So, King Philip V was a Spanish Bourbon king. He actually advocated century-long effort to reform and modify the Spanish Empire. From 1700s to 1746, he really wanted to reform and modify the Spanish Empire, because maybe he already saw the atrocities, the violence, and the abuse of power by previous kings and monarchs. For that reason, King Philip V advocated the Bourbon Reform. It is called a Bourbon Reform because King Philip was a Bourbon king, a known ethnicity in Europe. Bourbon Reform are the policy changes endeavored to curtail contraband commerce, reclaim control over transatlantic trade. Example of this transatlantic trade is the trade between Manila and Acapulco, Mexico. This is the galleon trade that were discussed in the previous lessons. To continue, the reform includes restricting the church's power because somehow friars really abused their power. Reform state finance to fill dwindling royal coffers and found tighter administrative and political control within the empire. Now, what are the effects of Bourbon reforms to the Philippines? So it has been advantageous to the Philippines, which was under Spain from 1564 to 1898. So it has some positive impact to the Filipino people before. They surely impacted the way the colony was run by Spanish administrators, but only to a limited extent. For one thing, the Philippines was practically far from Spain, and so it was hard for Bourbon advocates to check if reform policies were properly implemented in Spain's colony in the Far East. Because the Bourbon king is very far away from our country, he doesn't know what is happening here. So even though the Bourbon reform has had a positive impact, but due to the king or queen or the monarch's inability to monitor how the representatives implementing these policies was a problem. The question now is, was it effective before? Is it effective during those times? First, the policies lack some ideological coherence. Balance the crown's several commercial, administrative, fiscal, and military aims. So there are deficiencies in this reform. What will happen if there are deficiencies? What will happen is that it will not protrude. Second, it was so complex, much so that Spanish reformers sometimes promoted distinctly different kinds of policies for provinces in its diverse empire. In the Philippines, we have our 1987 Constitution. Our Constitution can be interpreted in different ways similar to the Bourbon Reform. So what will the government do is that the Senate will try to create laws grounded from the 1987 Constitution so that we'll be having a smooth implementation of law and a legislating body. But on the case of the Bourbon Reform, before, it was very complex that those representatives of the king on different colonies have different interpretation of it. In result, they tried to implement different policies because of its complexity. Lastly, there were instances when European conflicts forced Charles IV to go from one policy to another by the mid-790s to meet the needs of financing Spain's wars. So to answer the question, is it effective? Well, it has some positive impacts on some of the colonies, but as we can see, it is not that effective, and that is the impact of Bourbon Reform. Its impact at least is that it gave people, especially the natives in the Philippines, the idea that colonization could be done without much intervention from the Catholic Church. Other political influence is called the Cadiz Constitution of 1812. Now, what is this Cadiz Constitution? It is a liberal constitution that was promulgated in Cadiz in March 1812. When we say liberal, it focuses on change or on reform instead of having an absolute monarchy. They wanted to have a constitutional monarchy. In this constitution, the power of the king is limited. This was actually drafted by elected representatives that was put in practice in almost all the areas of the Hispanic monarchy, still under the control of the Spanish crown. It is also the first constitution in Europe to deal with national sovereignty as coming from the people and not from the king. When the Cadiz Constitution was promulgated and implemented, the Philippines have their first delegates who took office in Madrid. They will be the representation of the Filipino people before. They were Pedro Perez de Tagle and Jose Manuel Corrito. So the Cadiz Constitution, which was formally implemented in Manila soon after, established the principles of universal main suffrage, national sovereignty, constitutional monarchy, and freedom of the press, and advocate land reform and free enterprise. Even though the Cadiz Constitution as a liberal constitution was really advantageous, there were still negative situations that had happened. And what are these? First, they invalidated the liberal constitution. They did not accept the Cadiz Constitution. So on May of 1814, King Fernando VII declared it invalid and restored absolutism. However, Cadiz was a very significant period in the political history of the Spanish-speaking world, at least on the part of the locals in the Philippines. One crucial creed embodied in the Constitution was the exemption of the natives from paying tributes and rendering public services based on its equality clause. Because before, the natives, people in our country, pay taxes and also render public services by making roads or different infrastructures. Anyway, that would be all for this virtual lecture. Hope you had learned something, and thank you so much for listening, and may God bless us all.